This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Kathryn, and I are going to talk about keeping your storylines present and clear. So, this is something that just came up. I'm teaching a class on speculative fiction, and we're reading Octavia Butler's novel, Dawn. So a good, excellent science fiction piece here. And we just started the third part. It's a 4-act story with 4 parts. So I was saying that in this part, we've shifted away. Let me back up. Science fiction story, our protagonist Lilith wakes up on an alien spaceship having been in suspended animation for 250 years because humans blew up the Earth, basically. I mean, the planet's still there, but it was an apocalypse. And so now Earth is just about ready for people to go repopulate it. So she's been woken up to be one of the first teams of humans sent back to Earth by the aliens to repopulate it. So in part 3, we've shifted away from her relationship to the aliens, discovering the world, learning about the world, and moved into her waking up other humans and developing a team to take with her to the planet. Okay. So I said our focus has shifted from the aliens to the humans, and one of my students said, no. It's all about being humans and having self-determination and escaping the aliens' control. Right? And I said, no. Yes, but no. So this got me thinking about how every story has multiple storylines, and those storylines come and go from the 4 of the story we're trying to tell as we write, So her overarching plot, if we're looking at Freytag's pyramid here, the big line from page 1 to the end is that human versus alien conflict. Will I be part of an alien breeding program, or will I be an earthling, a human, and have self-determination and freedom, right? But then within each act, we've got storylines nested within that overarching storyline. And with 4 distinct parts in this book, we've got 4 distinct storylines that are all part of that big main plot. So that's all set up to say this got me thinking about the way when we write books, we've got the one primary through line, but we also have other ones to work with to tell different pieces of our story. And I thought we could talk about that. So when you're writing, are you aware of all those multiple storylines from the beginning? Are they kind of organically coming and going?
No, I don't think so. I think even though I would consider myself to be a consummate outliner, definitely the only thing I really outline is the main protagonist plot. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, once I'm actually in the middle of writing first draft, things might occur to me, go, oh, okay, I could make that so that this person came from here and, they've got some other driver or something like that, some other motivation. So no, I don't think I would, well, at least not in the 2 sort of trilogy arcs that I've written, I wouldn't say that it's come to me as specifically as that. Mm-hmm. But that sounds like quite a complex story. Are the 4 parts all from the same point of view? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's all single protagonist, third person point of view, and this is a classic portal fantasy, although it's science fiction.
Yeah.
And so we skip the part where the protagonist is in her home world and then walks through the portal, and we open the book where she wakes up inside that new world. We don't really need to be told what the home world was like. It's our world, post-war, right? Post-apocalypse. So the first part is typical setup and introductions of Act 1. Who am I? Where am I? Why am I here? Who are these aliens? What is this all about? The second act is the transitional phase of the portal fantasy, where she's learning how to navigate the world, who she is in relation to this world and the aliens, and also what her role is in this world. You know, how she can function and what her identity is here, and what that means in relation to all the other parts of the world. And then in part 3, she's actually fulfilling her mission. So the transition is complete, and now she is being the hero of, you know, she's waking up other people to build a team. So she's become a leader with a mission of her own. We haven't gotten to part 4 yet, but I know it's called Training Ground. So I assume that's when Lilith will take her human team into, like, the aliens created a jungle for her to train in, because going back to Earth, it's going to have, you know, there will be no civilization. So I think it'll be her and the human team training to prepare for Earth. So another phase of her mission. But each story is a distinct part of the whole. And even though our overarching concern is that alien breeding program versus freedom, she's got a different mission in each section, right, you know, defined by those 4 stages I've just outlined.
Right. Do you think this is particular to fiction that is broken into, like, parts? Because I've seen a lot of books that have part 1, part 2, part 3. And sometimes they do follow the 3-act structure very, very faithfully, and sometimes they don't. You know what I'm saying? Like, they feel almost like whole books within themselves, but they're not. Yeah. You know, they lack something that makes them an entire book all in their own. Because you could almost make it into a 4-part trilogy, or, you know, whatever you want to call that, 4 books in a series.
Quadrilogy, but maybe?
Quadrilogy. But do you think that's specific to books that are like that, or do you think every story has those kind of authentic parts within it that we're writing that we maybe don't recognize?
That is a good question, and maybe the answer to that is no. We don't always have these distinct stories. You know, we've got our plots and our subplots, and those subplots tend to be about the supporting characters and the relationships. This book, Dawn, does feel somewhat different, though, because she's in a distinct setting for each of the 4 parts, and so she's got almost a different set of supporting characters and a different mission in each of the 4 parts. You know?
So why would the author make the choice then to make it all one big book rather than, say, splitting it into 4 books at those part lines?
Probably because the parts themselves are not that long. I mean, this is a smallish book, probably a 5x8 print, and it's 248 pages. So it's not, right, you know, it's not a super big novel. And this is the first book in a series. So I think the next book takes us to Earth. You know, so this is everything that happens on the spaceship with the aliens preparing to go repopulate the planet.
Gotcha. So it is one story, right? It's cohesive as one story. It's just got 4 very distinct parts within it.
Right. And I think the distinction between, you know, plot and subplot versus parts within a larger arc is that setting shift and supporting character shift that occurs in each part. And, you know, this just came up in class Tuesday, so I hadn't really thought about this before, processed it before, but the historical book I'm writing now is going to have 4 parts, which I decided before Tuesday. So, right. But coincidentally or not, each one is a distinct location. So because each location is distinct, the cast of characters surrounding my protagonist also becomes distinct. So the faces change along with the places. So that is a good case for having parts versus just subplots that run through your main plot.
Yeah, I suppose it's a narrative choice, isn't it, about what do you feel is going to drive the story forward? And one thing that occurred to me as well when we talk about speculative fiction, and especially considering Octavia Butler as well, there was a tradition that a lot of speculative fiction was published through sci-fi magazines and serialized. So a lot of readers are used to that sort of, chunk by chunk delivery of a science fiction story. And a lot of us would have read, well, certainly my age anyway, a lot of us would have read those types of stories where it only becomes evident as part of a bigger story as you complete it. So some of that might be just, style and voice choice as well. Where you're sort of thinking, oh yeah, I'd like to tell it in these 4 very distinct sort of different stories, not necessarily because it's going to be serialized in a magazine, but because that's what you grew up reading, That's it. That's how you like to consume it, and often we'll write things, or at least to start to write our first books in the way that we like to consume books in the old days. The other thing that occurred to me as well is that there's a couple of different things in there. There's the sort of complex series of mini plots that all pull together to bring, like you were saying before, that which is a hard work. I wouldn't recommend a new writer attempt something like that, because you really do have lots of separate plots that then have to tie together in one controlling idea.
Right.
And then there's the other thing that says, well, this is quite complex, so maybe if I attempt to write it all in one part, so to speak, am I going to end up with too many moving parts to juggle? And by dividing it into 3, 4, 5 or 6 parts, I make it more separate, both for me as a writer and also for the reader to consume, because the divisions are much more clear. And whether you choose to make those divisions by setting or by a different character taking over, because I've seen that done as well, or I suppose the George R.R. Martin style, where you've got alternating points of view, or multiple points of view, which is a little bit different to parts, right? But I've seen parts where it's been driven by a POV as well.
And I think,
I suppose there's a lot of choices about how it comes back to that. What sort of story am I telling? What's the theme? And it sounds as if with the Octavia Butler one, it's very clear what the theme is. So there's no trouble in tying each of those parts back to that.
Yeah, and I think another driving force for this choice is time as well. So besides those other shifts we've already named, between part 1 and part 2, the timeline is continuous, but the setting changes dramatically, and then the supporting characters also shift. And between part 2 and part 3, there's over a year-long break, somewhere between 1 and 2 years, that she just references briefly in part 3. And so having a part break is much stronger than a chapter break. So that's a nice way to make that kind of a transition and kind of signal to the reader, okay, we're chunking something here and just not bothering to go there. So what about the separate storyline piece of it?
Well, I think they have to be treated the same way as an overall story. I think, for it to be satisfying, well, let me backtrack. Because of the jarring nature of suddenly turning the page and facing part 2 or part 3 as a label, if it hasn't been completed, you need to feel like there's been a good reason that something's been left hanging, and you go, oh, okay, well, I wonder what's going to happen with this. But as is often the case with, say, reading multiple POV stories, you get really attached to your protagonist. And so obviously with Octavia Butler's story, that's why I asked, is it the same POV? Because at least you've still got that attachment carrying through.
Right.
But then if they're suddenly, it's 100 years on, if it's speculative fiction and they're long-lived, you're somehow losing what happened to all those other characters. And so I think it's tricky. There needs to be some form of payoff at the end of that, for me anyway, I think, at the end of that part, that says, right, there's some partial completion there and something left undone that is now going to get somehow picked up in this next part.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, you definitely can't leave the reader hanging and wondering what happened or why this was skipped. And I think Butler does an excellent job with the jump between part 2 and part 3, because she establishes at the end of part 2 that Lilith, our protagonist, is going to be helping one of the aliens go through kind of a metamorphosis. And then when part 3 opens, that's confirmed. Yes, she did go through that. And then she also spent a year in this jungle being trained in order to prepare her for waking up other people. And, I asked my students, why do you think Butler chose not to show us any of that time in the jungle? And they said, it's probably repetitive. It's probably boring. I said, yeah. And she probably wrote it, or at least some of it, and went, nobody wants to read this. The learning how to weave a basket in a jungle, or, which plants are poisonous and all that kind of information we need to know our characters have, but we don't necessarily need to see them acquiring it.
Yeah, and this is going to drive a key plot point, like say in the Hunger Games, where they knew about the berries early on, and then right at the end it's a payoff thing.
Right.
But even then, that's done in just a drip feed fashion. You do often see just as a sidetrack there, you do often see in YA stories, particularly where there's a rite of passage, you get these training montages where they go through, but it's still done in montage fashion. So it's not you'd never see part 2, an enormous multi-chapter training in the jungle. So it wouldn't advance the story, would it? You could just almost say, okay, they've finished their training and now they're back on Earth.
Yes. Yeah. Do you see a lot of parts in fantasy?
Yes. But I feel like they're different than, not entirely different, but I feel like a lot more in fantasy you see it broken straight at the act mark. You know what I mean? Like Act 1 is done, and then we move into Act 2, and it's just labeled. Like it doesn't feel, you know what I mean? It doesn't feel like it's necessarily starting a new segment of story. Maybe the scene doesn't, like the location doesn't necessarily change, or the characters don't necessarily change. It just feels like a marker. Is all it feels like. Because like what you're saying, I see it as almost more like a giant container, right? Like this is one big movement of our story, right? Right. Versus with a lot of the fantasy parts, it's literally just like, okay, you can put the book down now for a second.
That's right, have a rest.
Because you're staring at another 750 pages or whatever. Yeah. So a lot of the larger fantasies will have them, but it doesn't feel the same as what we're talking about here.
So it's more like the intermission, so you can go get a snack and
totally. Yeah. Versus serving the story with a purpose.
Yeah, I think it's in a way it's a convention to signal to the reader that this is an epic story, isn't it?
Yeah. That's an interesting use of the parts in the book. It's just as a signal.
Very, very different than like with the shorter book. It feels like it's much more just signaling like, okay, like here's a transition point, right? And I like that. I like building that structure into your story where you give that signal to the reader that this is a completely, we're here. All of what you just read matters, right?
Right.
But give yourself a new starting point. Give yourself a little mental refresh. Okay, now we're here. Now we're doing this. Which I think is a cool way of writing a story.
It is, and it wouldn't work for every story. I mean, I think it works so well for Dawn because we do have 4 distinct settings within this world, within this larger world.
And it sounds like you also have a lot of time passing. And it's hard to do that well, even with chapter breaks or scene breaks. It's hard to do a lot of time passing without jarring your reader, without having some sort of more significant break.
Right. You have to rely on that narrative transition of the seasons changed and, 6 birthdays passed or something like that.
Nobody really wants to turn from chapter 4 to chapter 5 and see 5 years later. Like that is bothersome. But if you went from part 1 to part 2, like that's a very different feel in the reader's psyche, I guess, in terms of how they're encountering that story.
Right. So time and space setting changes are great reasons to have parts in your book other than just signifying this is epic.
Right, because it feels like although there is different stories, right, different little mini segments of story, they're all very tied together. It's not like you have 4 very individual stories. You can follow the through line, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, it's not like you have 4 very different stories that you're telling within one book. It's just 4 segments of the story that have very different feels or different actions that go along with them.
Yeah, you've got the story is Lilith's journey, you know, aboard this spaceship where she's woken up after being, you know, in suspended animation for 2 centuries plus. And we are never allowed to forget that. There's always these reminders occur frequently of her ultimate goal is her freedom.
Right.
But she's got to learn these, you know, go through these different stages, and each stage has its own plot within a plot, ultimately. You know, a different process of discovery, a different set of supporting characters, a different thing she needs to learn or acquire before she can move on to the next part of the story. You know, and being on a spaceship, she is in an enclosed world, so there's nowhere for her to go. There is no running away, so it all has to be working within the system, you know, but still not letting us forget the ultimate goal is to get back to Earth and to be free.
Right.
It's almost like a gaming, you know, thinking, I'm not a gamer, but I'm just thinking, you know, in today's modern world, that would be analogous to gaming, where you don't get to the next part of the game unless you've completed this particular part, and that next part could be in a completely different setting. You might have completely different skills. You might actually lose some of the skills that you'd previously acquired and have to reinvent yourself. So I could think of another good reason for parts being if the character's personal journey was immense emotionally, or very compartmentalized. So maybe they had to come of age before then they could become a soldier, which then led to them being an empire leader. Yeah, that could end up being quite epic.
Right.
And if you chose to tell that all in one story, then it might make more sense to divide it into parts, so the reader gets a sense of, oh, here I am with them when they're young, here I am with them when they're, you know, becoming a responsible adult, and here I am with them when they're changing an entire culture.
Yeah.
So I could see that if the personal emotional journey was different, if the internal genre was very different, it might make it easier. Well, no, easier is the wrong word, I suppose. More enjoyable to consume, or more, or as you, because I think when we were talking before about making your storylines really clear, if that was all bundled into one long epic, would the reader lose a sense of, I don't know what this bit's about? You know, where is this heading? Yeah. And in some way, by showing parts, it is a bit like having the intermission saying, okay, now we're coming to Claudius's journey as a great emperor or something. You know?
Right. Yeah. So life stages would be another good reason to segment your book into parts. And again, those breaks, which are so much stronger than chapter breaks, signal to the reader, okay, moving ahead now. You know?
I think if you're looking at your story like that, though, you do need to step back and ask yourself, would this be better as separate books or separate parts? Because you may have enough to where you need to break it even further, right, into books rather than just parts within the story. Because it feels like, especially if you're talking about very separate journeys of like age, like you might have enough in that coming to age to do the very first book as coming to age rather than just the first 25-30% of the book. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we looked at the Exogenesis series, you know, the series arc has multiple books, but then this book, which is only 250 pages, she was able to chunk into 4 parts.
Right.
You know, but if you're writing, if part 1 is 200 plus pages, you might be looking at book 1 instead of part 1.
Well, you know, I mean, we have seen it done in some of those big old doorstopper type books. And again, maybe that was a publishing sort of a choice because, you know, the publisher was trying to sell real estate on the shelf. And maybe these days we would divide them up. Who's to say? But I'm thinking things like, you know, big giant family sagas or dynasty epics like Shogun and those sort of things.
Yeah.
Where you do have very distinct parts in the one giant novel. And I love those stories. They're terrific. And you do feel a sense of grief when you leave one part and move into another. And you're relying on the author's deft hand in that second part or third part or fourth part to grab you quickly. Because the danger is in presenting that intermission to the reader is that the reader puts it down and never returns.
Yes. Yeah, and you need each of your parts to end with enough of a compelling hook and not necessarily an action hook, but an emotional hook, a character hook that the reader can't wait to see what's happening in the next part. Because the bigger the transitional space, the bigger that hook needs to be to compel us to jump the gap. So scene breaks, small hooks, chapter breaks, medium hooks, part break.
Right.
Big hook, book in a series,
Yeah. Well, and I think that you would want also not to necessarily have quite as much of a satisfying ending at the end of your part as you would at the end of a book. Right. You want there to be a sense of finality of the movement, but you don't necessarily want it to be like, everything worked out, even with the hook.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you think, though, it could also be, I'm not disagreeing with you there, obviously you want to maintain narrative momentum for the reader. It could be, though, symphonic, though, couldn't it? So, in the sense that if you compare it to a big musical piece, then we could have something that ends with, I don't know, maybe a character becomes old and slips away, and the next part is a continuing of, I'm thinking Family Saga again, where we pick up maybe with a protagonist who was in the previous part.
Right.
Either way, you've got to get in the next part. If you're making your separations that distinct, I think you also owe it to the reader to come back to, why am I reading this? What's the hook at the start of the next part, and what's the inciting instant of that next part as well.
Right. And if you are going to do something like that where you kill off your main character, the one the reader's been tracking through this part, then you need to ensure that the next in line is present somehow in part one, so that we feel a sense of continuity when we jump the gap. And so we want to see how, Joe is going to survive without Grandpa Jacob or whatever your continuation is, so that the reader doesn't just get upset because they've lost thread A, character A, their primary concern for that entire part.
Yeah, so how does Octavia Butler handle that then in the separate parts there? Is it is there a clear hook at the beginning of each part that brings the reader into, okay, this is what this bit's about? Is it, because it sounds to me like there's some different controlling ideas for each of those parts?
Yeah, there are. So the first part is about learning who the aliens are and why she's there. And, she's finally told she's going to be let out of her isolation cell, and she's going to have to go live with a family of aliens in order to learn their language and their customs and, acclimate to this new place. And so there's a part break in there, so we're like, ooh, okay, this is going to be weird. This is like foreign exchange student times 100, right? How is she going to make out in this situation? And then that part ends with another big transition in her life, where she's going to go from living with the family, the host family that has trained her, to, we're told she's going to go live with the young alien and his wives, the one who's been training her the most. So it's another shift in location. She's got to physically move her residence, right? But when we jump the gap, the next part is where she's in a new isolation chamber that's big, and she's got to wake up 40 humans to build a team. So the time she spent with the new alien family is skipped over.
Yeah, right. So she doesn't waste any time in establishing the next new part. It's obvious.
Right.
Okay, now this is my mission. So I suppose that's the other thing as well, is that if you're attached to that one protagonist, you've got to know what their next object of desire or their next want is in that next part pretty quickly. Because if you finished with it or dispensed with it in the first part, moving into a new setting, the temptation as an author would be, okay, well, it's all about this new setting, and isn't it interesting and fascinating? But actually, it's not. It's really about what does the protagonist want in this part, and how they're going to get it. And the setting is just part of what drives that.
Yeah, and Butler does tell us from pretty much the beginning that Lilith has been selected to wake up and lead other human beings. Yeah. So when we get to part 3, that year and a half or 2 years has been skipped, but we aren't disoriented. We're like, okay, now we come to the part where she gets to wake up people. So there's no confusion, even though Butler creates a big gap that we have to jump over.
It reminds me of that whole, I think, is it Elmore Leonard or someone like that who said, what do you, how do you make your writing interesting? He said, I leave out the parts that people skip.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So it's kind of sounds like Octavia Butler's done that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Final thoughts on parts, writing in parts?
I've never been tempted to do it, but I can see now that that's another creative choice, actually, to introduce narrative drive or to deal with big jumps in a different way.
Right.
Yeah, I always thought it was a bit old school, but I can see that there's some interesting potential there.
Definitely. I think it's a worthwhile tool to keep handy, and Butler does a great job with it in Dawn, so if anyone's curious, it's also a really good book. My students are getting scans as we go, so they can't read ahead, and they get mad because, the scan ends and there's like 2 paragraphs of the next chapter, and they can't not read that little chunk, but then it cuts them off. They're left with a cliffhanger, so...
Mean.
Dude. Yeah. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.